Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Weber for this kind introduction, and I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to take part in this conference and for the opportunity to share with you some thoughts on historical significance of the events of 1956. The topic I was entrusted with, or we were entrusted with, coincides with the title of the whole of our meeting, and there is no way to exhaust it during this short speech. I am convinced that many problems will recur during subsequent panels. In our discussion, we will also tackle issues not mentioned in this lecture. The first and the basic context of the history of 1956 is the experience of the peoples of East Central Europe. All other issues, including the international situation and changes in the Soviet leadership after Stalin's death, must be considered only in second place. The year 1956 was a reaction to the communist dictatorship, that is, terror and repression, economic exploitation, propaganda, loss of independence, forced godlessness of society, etc. In my opinion, this experience must be the starting point for any analysis of the situation of 1956. If we fail to understand what was the experience of the first decade of communism, really for the Hungarians, Poles, and other nations, will not be able to understand what actually happened 60 years ago. Undoubtedly, the Stalinist period was the time of greatest pressure on societies of East Central Europe. This was achieved not only by terror, but also propaganda. But does it mean that the communists were able to make a permanent change in attitudes, ways of thinking, or value systems of individual nations? The answer to this question may be found when we look at the uprising of residents of Poznań on the 28th of June 1956. It started with the demands of a typically economic nature. After only a few hours, they were followed by political and religious ones, such as free elections, release of Primat Wyszyński, returning religious instruction to the schools. At the time of taking the fight, the slogans of independence took over, a basic demand being to break from the Soviet dominance. How to explain such a rapid, taking only a few hours, transformation of the nature of the protest? It did not have any leadership, so the change came spontaneously. It is hard to assume that the views of residents of Poznań had changed so fast. We should rather accept the fact that with the growth of sense of their strength, the participants of the rebellion started to reveal their true beliefs and desires. A similar mechanism appeared in Budapest on the 23rd of October 1956. This indicates a complete failure of efforts of communists aiming to shape a so-called new man. But this does not mean, however, that the Stalinist period had not had a lasting impact on the attitude of individual nations. To the latter issue, I will return later. Another important element of the context of the events of 1956 are earlier protests in Czechoslovakia and East Germany in June 1953. They had a direct impact, especially on the situation in Hungary, I mean the first government of Imre Nagy and limited liberalization of the system. But I would like to draw your attention to another aspect of these events. Their result in both countries was not only repression, but also a change in the policy of the communists, especially in economic matters. They brought improvement of the situation of the society and thus the weakening of potential rebellion. In 1956, the position of the communist parties in both countries was much stronger than 3 years before. In this way, at the moment of crisis, public feeling in Poland and Hungary somehow missed this in Czechoslovakia or East Germany. Also in these countries, requests for change did appear. However, the communists easily regained control over the situation. This is an important context for any discussion over whether the collapse of the communist system in Central and Eastern Europe was possible already in 1956. Such a scenario would have been quite likely if not for the bad timing of social protests in these 4 countries. Of course, we cannot be sure that if there had not been strikes and demonstrations in Czechoslovakia and East Germany in 1953, they would have happened in 1956, but this seems probable. Another element of the context of the events of 1956 is, of course, the situation in the leadership of the Soviet Communist Party after Stalin's death. It influenced the course of events both in Hungary and in Poland, but in different way. In the first case, the impact of Stalin's death took place earlier in the form of the weakening influence of Matyas Rákosi and appointment of already mentioned first government of Imre Nagy, pursuing a policy of new cars. In Poland, at the same time, instead of any signs of liberalization, we are dealing, in fact, with tightening of repression symbolized by imprisonment of Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński in September 1953. The situation in Poland was significantly influenced by the next phase of the struggle for power in the Soviet leadership. Khrushchev's so-called secret speech in which he condemned some Stalin's crimes was to serve the ultimate strengthening of the position of the first secretary of the Soviet Party. In the case of Poland, however, it contributed to deepening the crisis of in the Communist Party, associated with the sudden death of Bolesław Bierut in Moscow. Only in Poland, the text of Khrushchev's speech in which he condemned some Stalin's crimes was to serve at the same time, instead of any strengthening of the position of the ultimate party in the first secretary of the Soviet. Case of Poland, however, to deepening it contributed associated with the Communist Party, the sudden death of Bolesław. Only Bolesław Bierut in Moscow, the crisis of the communist of Khrushchev's speech in which he in Poland, the text crimes was to serve at the same time, instead of any position of the first strengthening of the ultimate first secretary of the Soviet Party. In the case of Poland, however, to deepening condemned some Stalin's associated with the Communist Party, the sudden death of Bolesław Bierut in Moscow. Only the crisis of the communist speech in which he of Khrushchev's in Poland, the text crimes was to serve at the same time, instead of any strengthening of the position of the ultimate first secretary of the Soviet Party. It contributed condemned some Stalin's to deepening associated with the Communist Party, the sudden death of Bolesław Bierut in Moscow. Only the crisis of the communist of Khrushchev's speech in which he in Poland, the text crimes was to serve at the same time, instead of any strengthening of the position of the ultimate party in the first secretary of the Soviet. It contributed to deepening condemned some Stalin's associated with the Communist Party, the sudden death of Bolesław Bierut in Moscow. Only the crisis of the communist of Khrushchev's speech in which he case of Poland, however, at the same time, instead of any crimes, was to serve strengthening of the position of the ultimate party in the first secretary of the Soviet. It contributed condemned some Stalin's to deepening associated with the sudden death of Bolesław the Communist Party, Bolesław Bierut in Moscow. Only the crisis of the communist of Khrushchev's speech in which he case of Poland, however, in relation to Hungary. Briefly, I would like to indicate another important context created by the policy of the West, especially the United States. Between 1953 and 1956, a fundamental change in terms of the approach to Eastern Bloc and the willingness to confront took place. the focus of competition between the two blocs increasingly moved outside Europe. In the area of verbal statement, however, it was maintained that the goal is at least a peaceful liberalization of captive nations, as John F. Dawes put it in December 1955. The peoples of East Central Europe lived in the illusion and that the West was willing to engage in support of their aspirations for freedom. The more painful was the disappointment during the events of autumn 1956. Ladies and gentlemen, viewing from today's perspective, usually we present the events of 1956 as a part of logical sequence of events leading to the final collapse of the communist system. Sometimes it manifests itself in the visualization of dominoes symbolizing the successive crises of systems seen as steps in the collapse of communism. We could see it, for example, during anniversaries in Berlin and Gdańsk, and I think in some other places too. It is really how we should see the impact of events in 1956 on the history of the communist system. In my opinion, it is worth considering a different interpretation. Overcome crises may be also seen as an element of strengthening the system. Their effect was at least a temporary weakening of resistance, mobilization of the Communist Party, introduction of the reforms, which usually resulted in at least temporary improvement of living conditions of population. Overcoming successive crises and adapting to the new situation, the communists extended their rule. The above-mentioned mechanism may be traced on the familiar to us all example of developments in Hungary after the suppression of the revolution. After several years of massive repression, Kadar's regime began to reform, which resulted in the improvement of the situation of the society. As a result, for more than a quarter of a century, the system had been stable, and the opposition formed in the late 70s failed to mobilize the public to mass protests. In addition, this stability had been achieved at considerably lower cost than it was before 1956. A similar mechanism was used in Czechoslovakia after the suppression of the Prague Spring. On the other hand, on the Polish example, we can point to the consequences of the events of 1956, which in the long run undoubtedly had an impact on the subsequent collapse of the system. The two most important were the restoration of independence and importance of the Catholic Church and continued decollectivization of agriculture. When taking stock of particular crises, we should take into account both aspects and wonder to what extent they weakened and to what extent they in fact strengthened the communist system. In 1956, for the last time before 1989, a large part of the inhabitants of East Central Europe, at least for a moment, believed that the fall of the communist system and regaining freedom were possible. The consequences of the collapse of this hope after Second Soviet intervention in Hungary were significant. The attitude of adaptation strengthened. Also, the engagement on the side of communists gained a new rationale, not ideological or arising out of fear, but pragmatic. Many people felt that if the regime change is not possible, one should act within its framework. This change in attitude can be seen during subsequent crises. In 1968 in Czechoslovakia and Poland, and in 1970 in Poland. Despite the passage only of a dozen or so years since 1956, slogans of the reform of the system and not its change dominate. Also emerging in the coming decades, opposition movements took this situation into consideration, the majority without making radical demands to overthrow the communist regime. It is impossible not to notice that this consequence of 1956 also make the communist system in Central and European Europe stronger. In this context, I will argue that after 1956, the communists also received some kind of dividend from the previous Stalinist terror. It lasted in the social memory, strengthening the fear of undertaking any activity that could be interpreted as anti-communist. The events of 1956 also affected the relations between Moscow and its satellites. Of course, the process of changing these relations had already started, but the events of 60 years ago played a key role here. The margin of autonomy of individual leaders, especially in domestic politics, increased. The Soviet Union abandoned an inefficient system of detailed control over all spheres of life in the countries of the Eastern Bloc. The symbol of recognition of the position of local leaders of the communist parties was a series of consultations Khrushchev conducted before the second intervention in Hungary. Economic relations changed as well, the interests of individual countries of the Soviet bloc being taken into account to a greater extent. In this way, Moscow has retained control over their sphere of influence, exercising it, however, at a much lower cost. Anticipating a possible controversy, I do remember about the conflict with China, later being supported by Albania. I agree that also in this case, the events of 1956 and their consequences played an important role, but they did not have a key character. The causes of Sino-Soviet dispute were much deeper, and the split would have occurred anyway. The events in Poland and Hungary also affected the resignation by the United States in the European context from the policy of rollback of communism. This happened despite the efforts of military circles which sought to save in the American doctrine at least a theoretical possibility of support of some countries of Eastern Bloc in the case of Soviet aggression. In this way, under the influence of events of 1956, the West finally accepted the division of Europe into spheres of influence. The Cold War did not end, however. The primary battlefield in between the two political and military blocs became other parts of the world. To conclude this part of my speech, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that in spite of bloody suppression of the Hungarian Revolution and thousands of victims, the crisis in the world communist movement was much smaller than after the intervention in Czechoslovakia 12 years later. The break with Moscow concerned individuals, including some intellectuals and minority groups, but not the whole communist parties, as it was the case after 1968. It tells us a lot about the nature of captive mind, to refer to the term introduced by Czesław Miłosz. Apparently, for a communist, it is easier to come to terms with the massacre of counter-revolutionaries than to face crushing the dream of socialism with a human face. Ladies and gentlemen, remembrance is the main theme of our symposium, so please allow me to dedicate more attention to it than to the problems of the context and impacts of the events of 1956. I will focus mainly on the Polish case, although probably part of my conclusions is of universal character. The fight for the memory of the events in Poznań began immediately after the shots ceased. The communist authorities launched a gigantic propaganda campaign referring to the events in Poznań as provocation, counter-revolutionary rebellion of hostile elements inspired by agents of imperialism. Establishing element of this version of events was the funeral of part of the victims at the Poznań citadel. Apart from the security apparatus officers and soldiers, several civilians who were treated as innocent victims of counter-revolution were burned. In this way, a lasting impression of the official version of memory was created. This narrative collided with the legend passed from mouth to mouth, showing the June protests as a brave struggle for freedom taken by the heroic inhabitants of Poznań against the Soviets and Polish communists. Rumors of this period became for many years the foundation for the memory of Poles of the events of 28 June. In the first months, it mobilized social resistance. The official version of events changed already in October 1956. In his first speech after taking office, Władysław Gomułka burdened members of previous party leadership with responsibility for the protests, claiming that they had failed to communicate with workers. What's more, Gomułka declared the protests to be justified and constituting a painful lesson for the party. He saw in it a manifestation of the class wisdom of workers, who thus got the party back on track. At the same time, he stressed that the rebellion was not directed against socialism. Gomułka completely rejected the existing interpretation, saying, "The inept attempt to present the painful tragedy of Poznań as the work of imperialist agents and provocateurs was a great political naivety. Gomułka's speech brought concrete consequences in the form of interrupting repression against the participants of the events, as well as made the first analysis possible. In the next few months, several articles devoted to June 1956 were officially published, as well as, for example, poem by Kazimierza Iłakowiczowna, "My Heart Was Executed." There were also demands for the construction of the monument, appearing even in the press. Gradually, however, the number of such publications was limited by the intensifying censorship. Reconciling the memory of anti-communist uprising with the official narrative of the Communist Party was in fact not possible in the long run. Finally, the policy of oblivion was decreed by the leader of the Communist Party, who shortly before the first anniversary of the protest met with workers of the Cegielski factory. Gomułka found that the memory of the uprising in Poznań fits the black reaction and urged the fallen be not considered heroes, and, this is a quotation, draw a mournful veil over the whole story. Following these directions, authorities wanted to restrict the anniversary celebration to laying wreaths on the graves of the victims. Independent action had been largely paralyzed by the communist security apparatus. For instance, the idea of suspension in one of the streets signs with the new name of 28 of June 1956 was not realized. Of broader scale was only the religious celebration in the form of the Mass for victims of pacification. In subsequent years, the memory of the events in Poznań was passed to the private sphere and the church. In the official studies of the history of the Polish People's Republic, there appeared only cryptic references of unspecified disturbances and accidents in 1956. Memory has survived, however, in public consciousness, as evidenced by numerous references to the Poznań uprising in the statements of Poles carefully reported by the secret police in subsequent years. For a group of so-called revisionists, supporters of the liberalization of the policy of the Communist Party, memory of the events of the autumn 1956 became important. It was not, however, the anti-communist demonstration or the common solidarity with the struggling Hungary, but the contemporary situation in the party and so-called achievements of October, of which the majority was later withdrawn. The culmination of this phenomenon was a meeting at Warsaw University on the 10th anniversary of the events, during which a famous speech by Leszek Kołakowski was delivered. As a result, the philosopher was expelled from the party along with a group of writers, supporting him. The memory of the events of 1956 became one of the areas of activity reviving in the second half of the 1970s opposition. In June 1976 in Warsaw, there appeared leaflets calling for participation in the mass held on the anniversary of protests in Poznań. References to 1956 appeared in the program documents of the opposition. June in Poznań and Polish October 56 were mentioned in papers of the emerging independent publishing cycle. The real explosion of memory occurred after the strikes of August 1980 and the creation of the Solidarity movement. The Union Press published hundreds of articles devoted to both events in June and October 56. Many exhibitions devoted to this subject were organized as well. For the Solidarity, the year 1956 and subsequent mad protest was an element of its genealogy and at the same time constituted historical legitimacy of the social movement. The power of memory was so great that it prompted the authorities to make concessions. Also in the official publishing houses, books dedicated to the events of 1956 appeared. The most important was, however, the unveiling of a monument in the form of two crosses in the center of Poznań. The opening ceremony of 28th of June 1981 was attended by delegations of Solidarity from all over the country, amounting to nearly 200,000 people. The memory of the 1956, next to that of 1970, was then in the center of Polish remembrance. It is worth emphasizing that the Hungarian Revolution was also remembered. The Union Press and underground publishers published texts of historians and eyewitness accounts of the events in Hungary. For instance, the Hungarian Diary by Viktor Voroshilski had 7 editions in the 1980s, and the report by Sándor Kopacsi up to 15 versions printed in the underground. The memory of the fate of Hungarians on the one hand showed the nature of the communist system, and on the other was a kind of memento. Along with the memory of the intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968, it became a source of a phenomenon that Jacek Kuroń called the self-limiting revolution. Wishing to avoid the Soviet aggression, Solidarity had been abandoning far-reaching demands like independence of the country, free elections, etc. This attitude, however, did not prevent the imposition of martial law in December 1981. In subsequent years, the memory of the events of 1956 became one of the elements of the struggle of the underground Solidarity with the communist authorities. Often it was led in a literal way, for example, during demonstrations organized at the foot of the monument in Poznań. The communists were no longer able to win, despite the fact that they continued to make concessions. They issued, among other things, more books about 1956, presenting the official, but still different than in the past, version of events. During the collapse of the communist system, unlike in Hungary, the memory of these events did not play a major role. It was not an essential point of reference for either the opposition or the authorities. After 1989, the events of 1956 became the theme for several films, many books, and even rock and hip-hop songs being present in each synthesis of the history of Poland and school textbooks. These events, however, have lost their past prominent place in the Polish remembrance. Initially, they were outplaced by issues related to the creation of Solidarity and martial law, such as massacre in Wujek coal mine. Today, the symbol of the fate of the Poles under the communist rule are rather soldiers of anti-communist underground, of whom thousands were killed and buried in unknown places. Regardless of this process, it is noteworthy to deal with some other phenomena. With access to previously closed archives, a broader description of the events of autumn 1956, such as the anti-communist demonstration, overthrowing of Soviet monuments, aid campaigns for Hungary became possible. In many places, these events have found their place in local remembrance. Celebrations are being organized, plaques founded, heroes honored. Another interesting from the point of view of memory studies phenomenon is the rivalry of two versions of memory of 1956. The first of them may be called anti-communist, the dominant element being the uprising in Poznań, along with other smaller protests of autumn 1956. The second, much simplifying, may be called post-communist, although it is also close to some of the representatives of the former opposition. It refers to the history of reformist stream in the party and the Communist Youth Association, workers' councils and student committees operating in autumn 1956, and threats of the Soviet intervention in October. This second memory prevailed in the mid-90s, which was particularly evident in 1996, when post-communists were in power. Over time, it was outplaced by the anti-communist memory, of which the great celebration in Poznań in June 2006 have become a symbol. In comparison with Hungary, the memory of 1956 in Poland plays a much smaller role. It did not become a canvas for any significant political disputes. Neither a dispute about Władysław Gomułka arose, in contrast to the debate around the evaluation of Imre Nagy. Small debates on this issue were led by historians, but most Poles remember Gomułka as not as a momentary hero in the autumn of 1956, but as a dictator responsible for the massacre of December 1970. But the problem of remembrance of 1956 is still not closed case. To show you what kind of issues we experienced 25 years after fall of communism, it is enough to say that there are still 5 cities in Poland with the streets named by Soviet General Popławski, responsible for massacre in Poland, and a special law had to be adopted by parliament to solve this problem. Ladies and gentlemen, our reflection on 1956 should not be confined to the issue of their context, impact, and remembrance. It is also worth considering what kind of legacy has been left to us by participants of the events. There can be many answers. One of them was given by Albert Camus, at that time deeply involved in support of the Poles and Hungarians. 2 weeks after the bloody suppression of the uprising in Poznań, the French writer said, "I would never encourage the people in whose fight I cannot participate to fight and revolt. But now, when these people had revolted at the end of their humiliation and they then were murdered, I would feel contempt to myself if I dared to display the least restraint in assessing murder and not give all my respect for the victims of repression and express total solidarity with them. They certainly do not need our congratulations. They only expect that whether there is general freedom, their cry was widely echoed, so that others could notice their despair, that the eyes of the whole world opened, that everyone got to know and respected their decision." A year later, in a text entitled "The Blood of Hungarians," Camus wrote, "It would be indeed be difficult for us to be worthy of such sacrifices, but we can try to be so. If their distress is ours, their hope is ours also. In spite of their misery, their chains, their exile, they have left us a glorious heritage which we must deserve. Freedom, which they did not win, but which in one single day they gave back to us." So this is our heritage: freedom, solidarity, and non-indifference. It depends on us whether we will be worthy of that sacrifice. Thank you very much.